Okay, cool. Cool. Okay, so the title of the project is Generation is Required for Robust Perception. So the high-level motivation for this work is the question, should visual perception be modeled as a discriminative or a generative computation? So if you go back to von Helmholtz or with people like Carl Friston, there's this idea that visual perception relies on an internal generative model or decoder. But the most successful perception models in machine learning today are discriminative or encoder only. So we approach this question by studying mathematically whether generative or discriminative computations are required for compositional generalization. So compositional generalization is this ability to learn representations of concepts which generalize to novel combinations of concepts like penguin in a desert. And to formalize compositional generalization, we assume that images are generated by a latent variable model, where different concepts or objects in the image are captured by different subsets of this latent called latent slots. And we assume that this ground truth decoder has a certain structure, which we call additive. So basically, it decodes each slot separately and then sums the output to get the final image. And under this setup, we define compositional generalization as meaning that a model's learned slots capture exactly, each slot captures one object, one ground truth slot. So it's disentangled in distribution and it's disentangled also out of distribution. And mathematically what this means is that the model inverts the ground truth generator both in distribution and out of distribution. And there's basically two ways you can do this. There's the discriminative approach, where you try to learn an encoder which just directly inverts the ground truth decoder everywhere. Or the generative approach, where you try to learn a decoder which matches the ground truth generator, and then you try to leverage this to somehow learn the correct encoder. And so both of these approaches are mathematically possible, but they each require different inductive biases. So skipping over some details, to learn a decoder which has the right structure, you essentially need to enforce that you need to constrain the learned decoder such that it has this additive structure. And to learn an encoder that has the correct inductive bias, you need to constrain the learned encoder such that it's the inverse of this additive function. So what are some ways we can place constraints? Well, one way is via architecture. So constructing a decoder architecture such that the decoder has this additive structure is very straightforward, actually. But what we prove is that constructing an encoder architecture such that it is an inverse additive function is actually mathematically impossible. And we have a similar result for regularization, which I don't really have that much time to get into, but basically you can regularize a decoder such that it has the right structure, this additive structure, but it's basically impossible to regularize an encoder such that it has the right structure. So the kind of intuition I want you to take away is that the generative or the forward process is somehow a simpler function than the inverse process. And so the takeaways from this theory are that it's not really clear how to learn an encoder that just directly inverts the ground truth, but it's possible to learn a decoder that matches the ground truth generator. Okay, so what does this mean? How do we get compositional generalization then? So you have this learned decoder which matches the ground truth generator, so you can get compositional generalization if you can enforce that your encoder inverts your learned decoder everywhere. And you can do this in distribution by just training like an autoencoder, but to do this out of distribution, you basically have two options. The first option is what I'm calling offline replay, where you basically train your encoder, so you generate imagined or out of distribution images using your decoder, and then you train your encoder to map back those images to the representation which generated them. And yeah, using this objective. And then the second way is an online method, I'm calling it online search, where you basically update your encoder representation at test time using decoder feedback. And I want to mention that this sort of offline replay is similar to some stuff from Tim Behrens' lab, where they proposed that the hippocampus might be implementing some form of compositional replay. Okay, so briefly I'll talk about some experiments. So we run experiments on this data set from Meta, where basically you have two animals in the image and a background, and there's 32 different animal categories and 10 background categories. And we have a out of distribution set where basically you only observe some combinations of animals and backgrounds. So you don't observe like penguin in desert, for example. You observe penguin in like this environment on the left. And we train an encoder-only model on this data, which is a method called dinosaur. I don't have time to get into it. And our metric is we basically try to read out the object category from each slot. And what we show is that in distribution, you get basically perfect accuracy with this encoder-only model, but out of distribution, your accuracy drops to like 40%. If you train a decoder on the frozen encoder representation, which has the right structure, and you implement this replay mechanism where you generate these sort of out-of-distribution samples and train the encoder on that, then your accuracy out of distribution goes from basically 40% to 90%. So this is ongoing work. I don't have a preprint, but that's basically it. Yeah, thanks.